fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Now, today we have an incredible guest. We're really glad that she's decided to take the time to come on the show. We've talked about this case and had Marcia Clark and all sorts of people involved in it, and by far this will be the most important interview. So who we have with us on the line is Kim Goldman. Thank you for talking with us.
Oh, thanks for asking. I appreciate it. Wow.
So it's been 25 years now since your brother was murdered. So at this point in your life, how do you look back on the whole thing, an overall view of how the trial was handled, and what you think was representative of your brother?
Well, I guess I would say that I try to separate that a little bit, because I don't think that the overall trial was a representation of my brother. My brother was not very well acknowledged in that case. He was always just referred to as the friend or the other victim. But I think that what the trial and the subsequent, information that we've learned after the fact, the civil case, et cetera, I think really is just sort of demonstrates the injustice in our country. And we talk a lot about race and celebrityism and, just how things went wrong in that case. And then I also get to talk about my brother being a hero. So I think those two things are separate.
So, when we go back to the time, how old were you, and what was going on in your life when the murders happened?
I was 22. I was 22 and a half, probably. I was living in San Francisco, finishing up my schooling, and I was working full-time at Wells Fargo Bank and doing an internship at a psychiatric hospital, and applying for grad school, or just starting to apply to grad school.
What were you wanting to graduate in?
Psychology. I was one of those weird kids that knew exactly what she wanted to be at 6, and I always wanted to be a child psychologist. I benefited so much from therapy growing up that I wanted to be able to do that for a career, so that's what I was working towards.
So how did this murder impact that? Were you able to complete your degree? Did you ever go back into that field, or did you change totally?
I did not finish. I did not continue down that path at the time. I focused my attention on my brother and what was needed in Los Angeles at the time. And then I ended up in a couple of weird jobs after that, and then found my way back into nonprofit life. And so I was working for a handful of organizations that worked with people with autism, and then I ran an organization called Best Buddies for a long time, which worked with people with developmental disabilities. And then now I've been running an organization called the Youth Project that provides free mental health to teenagers, and I've been here since 2005. So I did make my way back years later, so I get to work with kids now and help them deal with depression and suicide and grief and domestic violence and such. So I was able to make my way back.
Well, that's important. Now, I have to ask, you've been out talking and doing your podcast and stuff, and one of the comments that came out was of course by Oprah and some of the others even. I've heard this, and Oprah asked, I remember, why don't you move on for you? How do you respond to that?
The same way I did all those years ago when she said that to me, which is, how do you expect me to do that? We don't have complete control over what the media does. We don't have complete control over what the killer does. And because he still commands so much attention, I'm left on the receiving end of that. And so even if in theory, or in my fantasy world, I wanted to have a killer-free existence in my life, I don't get to do that because he is who he is. And I just have to figure out ways to compartmentalize it and figure out ways to not let it suffocate me. And that takes a lot of energy to do that. And sometimes I choose to engage in it, and sometimes I don't. It doesn't mean it's not out there. The rest of the world can turn off the TV and choose not to participate. But it's part of me and it's attached to me, so I have to figure out a way to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of offensive in a way. It's kind of a just to even ask that. It changes your life.
But I think the term "move on," insinuates that you put something behind you, that you've gotten over it, or that's what that phrase sort of means. For me, I move forward, and sometimes I move left, and sometimes I go backwards, and sometimes I go right, because that's kind of how grief works. Yeah. It's not linear, and I'm trying to honor my grief and my loss and what we've experienced as a family, and it's going to look different for me than it does for other people, and I wish that was more respected than judged.
Yeah. And now, so how does that happen now? How do you choose and trust people that you meet, and how do you, like dating or any of that stuff? How can you analyze that? I don't do a very good job. That's why I'm so single. It's hard. My therapist used to tell me how trusting, he's surprised I'm still so trusting after all that I've experienced in my life. I think that as I've gotten a little older, I think my guard has gone up a little bit more than when I was younger, partly because I don't have the energy to deal with other people's BS sometimes. I do have a fear of being taken advantage of, or not being seen for who I am, and so I think I see things through a different lens than I did when I was younger. But I'm trying. It's a work in progress, as I hope I always am for the rest of my life. Yeah. Now you guys took ownership of the book, If I Did It, and you made some changes and stuff. Was that part of the lawsuit? Is that sort of why you were doing that?
Yeah, I want to be careful with the took ownership. We were ordered to take ownership of the book, so that's a little nuanced, but I think it's important because we didn't want the book published when we first heard about it, and we definitely didn't want him to benefit from it, which he did. And so when that happened, because he still, is ordered to pay a civil judgment, our attorneys levied or put a lien on the book and on the company that owned the book. It was a shell company that he created to funnel funds through it so we couldn't find it. He the killer, put that company into bankruptcy. The only asset of that was the book. The judge ordered us to monetize the book in order to pay off the bankruptcy fees and the debt that he owed. So it's a little tricky there. But once we did acquire the rights to the book, we were ordered to publish it, so we did sort of have to embrace it, and we read it as a confession at that time, and that was the platform we did it on.
And you've never really received any part or very little of the $33 million awarded.
Yeah, so the $33.5 million was awarded between the estate for Nicole Brown and my dad, our family, and it has grown over time because it adds interest every year. So I think our portion to date is like in the 80 million something range. But no, we've been unsuccessful in our pursuit. He's very much insulated by the law and by what he is required to pay. He's very much protected, and the civil system doesn't really afford any resources to people trying to collect on their judgments.
Can you tell us a little bit about your brother? What would you want people to know? I every day is a little bit different on the memories I have of him, because they present themselves at times where I need them. So, I think my brother was
such a champion for others and was such a lover of life and just embraced everything around him in such an optimistic way. I think I pull from that a lot because it's important for me to maintain some optimism in my life. But my brother, I think, who he was in his last couple minutes, I think demonstrates exactly who he was. He was a fierce protector. He was loyal to the end. He fought to try to protect his friend and protect himself. And I think that's a pretty heroic act. And I think that's what I want people to remember of him and just how much he's missed and loved by his family.
What was he planning at that time when he got murdered?
My brother was 25, just 2 weeks shy, 3 weeks shy of his 26th birthday, and was wanting to present my dad with a business plan for a restaurant that he wanted to open in the shape of an ankh, which is the tattoo that he had and the necklace that I wear of his. He was, wanted to be a business owner. He had been fumbling through his life a little bit and trying to figure out what was important to him and what his purpose was. And he kind of came into it, later and he had investors and had business plans and a design for his company. And that's where that was the next step he was planning to take and wanted my dad's support and backing.
So now when you go back to the trial, where do you think it went wrong? Like, who do you blame anybody in particular? I do. I think I place blame with the killer first and foremost. But I think that Judge Ito lost control of the courtroom, and I think that in doing so created a chaotic atmosphere, so that everything was up for grabs, and I think that the jury fell for that hook, line, and sinker, and no matter what the prosecution did or what evidence we had, I don't think that they were willing to see it. And I don't know exactly how and why that happened, but I talked to two of the jurors on the podcast, and they explained it a little bit, and they didn't see the case and the evidence for what we did and for what we believe it proved. So I don't know. I don't know what would have changed their minds, if anything, and I don't know what we could have done differently to alter the outcome. Did you find...
By we, I say the prosecution.
Right. Did you find one of the jurors that thought it was a conspiracy?
Yeah, they believe that there was something nefarious going on in the police department, and that there was the possibility that things could have been planted or conspired against the killer. I don't find any evidence of that. I don't think many people do. I think it seems more unreasonable than reasonable that an entire police force would band together to try to frame an innocent person, or to, as one says, maybe frame a guilty person. When you have a mountain of evidence, there's really no reason to continue to do that. But they dismissed it anyway.
Especially with the timeline, it's very bizarre how they would have had to go about planting that evidence.
Well, and it just doesn't make any logical sense. I mean, they had no idea if the killer had an alibi. They didn't know if he was dead or if he was alive. They had no idea anything about him, and they were going to conspire to plant and frame him. And for why? They revered him. They loved him. They got autographs and pictures with him. I mean, why would they do that? And why would they risk their careers and their pensions and their reputations for what? Why? Doesn't make any sense.
Have you ever thought about having OJ on your podcast?
Yeah, it's part of the process. It was part of the name of the show is Confronting him, and part of that is him in theory too. So that if he didn't end up being on, which I don't know that I ever thought that he did, it's the process. It's confronting all of it. It's the case, it's the trial, it's the witnesses, it's the grief, the domestic violence, it's the loss, it's, the public perception. And if he was courageous enough to want to be able to sit down, then I was open to do that. I just don't know that I thought in my heart that he would. Yeah.
Didn't you try to see him once when he was in jail in Vegas, or?
I did. It was important for me, to see him behind bars. The last time I saw him, we both walked out of a courtroom together, and so when he was, put in prison or in jail for the crimes that he committed. I was wanting to kind of shrink him in size to make it a little bit more manageable, the space that he had taken up in my brain, and to be able to walk out of there and have him sit behind and have his freedom taken from him. But I pursued that fiercely, got close, but then wasn't willing to sign the contract, the agreement, the way that it was presented to me.
What, they wanted a no disclosure agreement or something?
Yeah, his attorney, Yale Galanter at the time, we had a couple of conversations, and I appreciated his candor with me, but by the end, he asked me to agree. The condition was I would have to agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and I just wasn't willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, because then he could have, he could have said anything to you, right?
Of course, and that's why they wanted me to sign an agreement. They were concerned about that.
Oh, concerned. He's not a very good talker. So, what's your opinion on all that? Oh, the Twitter account and the way he talks about he has people to get even with and all of that stuff.
It's hard. Going back to what you said, the comment about moving on. I mean, it's very difficult to be going through my life as a single mom and a business owner and trying to, have some sense of new normalcy going on, and then be interrupted by that nonsense. It's painful because, when he talks and his mannerisms, all I'm looking at is the person that stabbed my brother to death. And it's very hard to reconcile how those two things can happen in the same lifetime. And so, it's gross. It's disgusting to me, but he is well within his rights to do it, and I can't stop that. I love that people go on and remind him constantly that he's a double murderer. I get some pleasure out of that.
Mm-hmm. And did you know the killer before the crime?
No, I had no idea who he was.
Oh, so you didn't even have an idea.
Mm-mm.
What's your thought on death penalty?
I support the death penalty. I never used to, because I was psych background and thought everybody could be rehabilitated. But when this happened, I changed my mind. I do understand the flaws in the system. I don't support the death penalty system as it stands today, but I do support the theory behind it. I wish that we would tighten it up. I wish we could get better at. I think it's just a waste of money to put people on death row now. I don't think it really carries the weight and the purpose behind it, but I certainly believe in the concept of it.
Would you be able to do it, but?
Would I be able to do it?
Yeah. I mean, with the killer, if you were given the button to push,
100%.
100%.
100%. He brutally stabbed two people to death. He nearly decapitated his wife. He stabbed my brother in the heart, the thigh, the lung, his jugular vein. What he did to those two people, innocent people, on that night is unforgivable and deserves to be met with the same torture.
Especially because your family was thrust into the middle of something so public. Your grief was public. The scene of, I just remember you and your father together when the verdict was read, and it just tore my heart out. I mean, you and I are a similar age. I'm kind of in between you and your brother in age, and I just saw what it did to your family was just heartbreaking.
Well, and I appreciate that. I think, loss is painful, and it looks different for everybody. Grief is different for everyone. I think what was hard for us is that it was on the public stage, and we were doing it under the scrutiny of a country, and in some ways that was great because it gave me an opportunity to share my big brother and to share my dad and our bond, and that's amazing because I'm super proud of them, and I was raised by great people. But in the same vein, it really it created a lot of emotion for a lot of people from the other side, and there's been a lot of hate, and there's been a lot of anger towards us, and that's been hard to reconcile too because we just were kind of dumped off into this world that I was, I didn't expect and couldn't prepare myself for. Not anybody should ever, but it's polarizing and it's isolating, and but for the most part, people have been very supportive and very loving, and I'm grateful for that.
Was there any help offered to you and your family to deal with this, not just the grief and the loss, but being thrust into the public eye?
In what way? Do you mean?
I mean by, say the prosecution or whatever.
So when the crimes happened, we were assigned a victim advocate from the district attorney's office, which should be available to every crime victim across the country. It isn't always, but we were assigned a victim advocate, Mark Arenas, and he was able to kind of walk us through the process and be there for us both emotionally and physically, and kind of explain how this was all going to go down. And we became, Mark and I became very close, but then because of, the elements of the case being so high profile, we became very close to the prosecution team, and I had a lot of access to them. But we tried all of the other avenues of support too, with support groups and therapy, and I waited some time to do that because at the time of my brother's murder, I wasn't really open and ready to that. But there are a lot of resources available. People just need to know how to find them.
You had a lot of responsibility as well. Your father seems like a really good man, kind of a stand-up guy, and he was devastated as well, and you had to take care of the funeral and everything, if I'm right. It wasn't, watching my dad, he was broke. I mean, both of us were. We had to get the funeral arrangements done. Someone had to do it, so we took family, friends of the family, and my dad and my stepmom, and my dad just couldn't bring himself to make decisions. He was just completely consumed with grief and shock, and I remember my dad just constantly saying, it should be me, him, and that's like just left such an indelible mark on my heart, and watching my dad suffer so greatly, it just, it's painful to see that, and our roles have changed over the years, but we are still tight as can be, and we share so much love and for each other and for my brother, and he's my touchstone. You talk about your brother Ron as a hero. Maybe I guess what I'm thinking of is probably from the car accident when you were 14.
Yeah, we were in Florida. My dad was dating his now wife, but his girlfriend at the time, and they were taking us back to our hotel, and a drunk driver was coming down the other side of the street, and his tire blew, and he hit a tree in the median, and in that process, the battery from the drunk driver's car came out and across the median into our car, and blew up in my face, and I suffered first, second, and third degree acid burns, and my stepmom had some acid brush across her face as well. My brother pulled me from the car. My dad, obviously was looking for help and running around grabbing Patty, and my brother grabbed me and pulled me to the side, and again, his instincts of being a protector, just right there in that moment too, and he sat with me in the hospital as my dad did, and just sat vigil with me, and I never left his side, and I'm so grateful for that. And he was, again, so optimistic in that moment, trying to crack jokes. I mean, my face was mutilated and charred, and my brother's still in there trying to make me see the silver lining.
Right. And that carried through to the night that he was murdered. What do you think happened actually that night?
I think that my brother walked into a scene where Nicole was being attacked by the killer, and I think he ran to try to stop it and got in the middle of it, and the killer pushed Nicole down, and she hit her head on the step, and had a contusion on the back of her head. That's why we believe that. And then the killer attacked my brother and stabbed him, and 5 fatal wounds, over 30 defensive wounds, and left him for dead.
Yeah, so he was...
And then went back and killed Nicole.
Yeah, he was trying to protect her at the time.
That's That's my belief. My brother was dropping off glasses that Nicole's mom had left at the restaurant that he worked at, that Nicole and her family ate at earlier in the evening. And I know lots of people want to attach some kind of importance to my brother being the one to do that. And but my brother had plans that night, and they were friends as far as I know, and that was the extent of that.
Yeah, there was a lot of gossip about him having an affair with her, but he actually had.
But she wasn't married,
right?
Yeah, and she wasn't married.
Yeah.
There's that little minor fact that doesn't make it an affair, and let's pretend they were. Let's pretend they were in an intimate relationship. That doesn't warrant being stabbed to death.
No, this is terrible. Now, you didn't know about the murder for a while, did you? How long did it take before you were notified?
So the murders happened on June 12th, and the news broke on the 13th. And my dad had the notification made to him at about 5 o'clock on that Monday, so it was on the news all day. And my dad was a salesman at the time and in his car a lot, and he had been listening to the news all day about Nicole Brown Simpson and another person being stabbed to death in Brentwood. So at about 5 o'clock when he received the call from the coroner, that's when he was alerted, and within maybe a minute of them making that call to my dad, my brother's face was plastered all over the news. I did not hear until about 6:30. I was working at the time and didn't get home until around 6:30, and that's when my dad told me.
Well, now, how did you deal with the verdict and the verdict celebrations and the people that were cheering when the killer got off?
I hibernated a little bit. I think I went to the gravesite. I wanted to be with my brother. I felt very disappointed and betrayed by the system and by the jury. I was obviously shocked and angry. It didn't make any sense, and still doesn't make sense to me on some levels, although I've gotten better at being able to understand it differently now. But it's hard. I mean, it's hard that the person that stabbed my brother to death, who I believe wholeheartedly did it, and killed Nicole, has his freedom and is walking the streets. That's really hard to reconcile, and I'm not any different than a lot of other families that have the same experience or that don't even have the opportunity to go to trial. Their cases are cold, so it's just, there's no way to explain it. You're just always on hyper alert.
Yeah. Now, I have to say, now Johnny Cochran, now he's passed since then, but he said something pretty awful after the verdict, didn't he? I misspoke at one point in some interview. He didn't say gotcha. He looked at me. He mouthed it. It was what I interpreted from the smirk that he and the killer both had when they looked at me in the courtroom. Right. He did not blurt it out. I didn't say that, but it got misconstrued to what happened. Okay. But again, I locked eyes. I know what the feeling was. I know what the insinuation was. They smirked at me, and then they mouthed it. That's my memory of it. But it's neither here nor there at this point. Caused a lot of stress for you as well. I think that with the Vegas arrest, when he got put in jail, I think you mentioned that it took away a lot of your stress.
It did. I think, when I don't think I realized how much I was not burdened with some of that anxiety until he was released back. Because when he was released back, I felt like anxious again, and I don't think I had realized truly how much stress relief it was for him to be behind bars. I mean, over time, I started realizing, I don't have to deal with it as much, but it wasn't until he was released back into the community. I thought, oh, God, I had a break from this for 9 years. But, even from behind bars, he was still able to create attention for himself. But it was a reprieve for a short period of time to be able to have a small sense of normalcy be returned.
I tell you, I just can't believe what you've been through. Now, what's your podcast about? Confronting O.J. Simpson, of course, but you have a lot of guests on. You've had Marcia Clark and Darden and all that. Meeting them, has meeting them changed your opinion of them from before?
No, I don't think it's changed my opinion. I think that I think that the sole purpose for me to have conversations was to get some understanding and to extend some compassion for people that walked a very similar path, but just different than mine. But we were all kind of conjoined to this case, and I think each of us dealt with it differently, and how it manifested in our lives was interesting to me. I mean, we talked to Cato Kalin, and I know that the world likes to think of him as a goofball, but he's just a down-to-earth guy that was sucked up in something just like the rest of us were, and how it impacted his life. I know that he's gone on to do some fun things for himself from a professional standpoint, but it really impacted him. He had death threats, and he hibernated too. It impacted his personal life deeply, as it did with everybody that was involved with the case. That was an important discussion for me to have with people. I think we forget the personal sacrifice of Marcia Criss and Bill Hodgman, the other prosecutor, and I think those are important conversations to have.
What about yourself? Have you ever had any negative comments about yourself directly, or email, telephone calls from crazy people who support the killer?
All the time. And I've certainly reported a number of threats because it's super scary to have people be so angry and to be so threatening. It's troublesome to me, but I understand it. I guess I understand it. I try to keep most of it at bay. Sometimes I can't help myself, but I engage sometimes because I'm human. I do try to. I know. I try to.
It's hard not to feed the trolls. Yeah. Yeah,
it's hard. And some days I'm better at it than others. And for the most part, I think I do a pretty good job of riding the high road. But I can't help it. It's harder for me when people go after my dad and my brother. I don't let those go by without comment. But most of the time, I just know it's somebody else's. It's somebody else's stuff. It's not about me. It's about them. And if people have enough energy and time in their life that they can seek out a complete stranger to talk about hurting them or wishing violence upon them, then that's more about them than it is about me. And I need to let that be.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we get that all the time, but not near on your level. That's for sure. It's I just get accused of working for the government. Now, you being in the psych major and doing all of that stuff, do you think O.J. ever had any remorse, or do you think he believes the story he says? Like, what's your professional opinion of that kind of a killer?
I think he's the straight up narcissist. I think he's a psychopath, and I think that he doesn't have the ability to show remorse. I think that's been demonstrated by everything that he's done. I mean, even when he wrote the confession, if I did it, I mean, there's no remorse in any of that. In the interview that he did afterwards, talking about it, I mean, he is void of that, and that's quintessential psychopathic behavior. So, but I am not a killer. I'm not a psychopath. I don't know how you function in that world. But for someone that, quote unquote, claims that he didn't do it, he certainly doesn't behave like a not guilty person. And for someone that claims he didn't do it, why doesn't he look for the person that did? Why isn't that important to him? Why isn't it important to him to get justice for his wife, the mother of his children, for some random stranger that tried to save his ex-wife's life? I mean, there's just nothing in his behavior that leads me to think he's anything but guilty.
We see those memes of him playing golf, and underneath it says, "I'm looking for the real killer," kind of thing. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
I, as a podcaster myself, I listened to your podcast every week when you were doing it, and I loved it. It was fantastic. Do you feel like you achieved what you wanted to achieve with the podcast?
I think so. I'm still kind of decompressing, and we have a few bonus episodes that are still coming out. So I think I'm still kind of in it. I'm trying to figure out where it fit and what I'm still yearning for. But I think, again, what was important for me is to talk to the people that were involved and to reiterate the truth and the facts behind what happened. I think there's a whole new generation of people that are learning about this case through a fictionalized lens, through conspiracy and cockamamie ideas about what happened that night. And it was important for me to try to lend a truthful narrative to the conversation, because I think that's been getting lost over the years, and to bring it back to victims and survivors of domestic violence and grief and loss and recovery. We don't like to talk about those things because they're not very sexy. So I thought it was important to have open dialogue, and that was probably the most important part for me of the whole podcast.
Have you seen any portrayals when you talk about the shows and the movies and the miniseries and stuff, the FX series and all that? Have you seen any good representations of what happened with the killing and all that?
No. Well, I should say from the fictionalized version, there's been lots of incredible documentaries that have been done. I'm all about the facts. I don't think that we need to be dramatizing and fictionalizing something that was played out for the world to watch. I don't understand why that was done, and it was done without the involvement of any of the people that were there. And while I appreciate that the FX show in some ways painted a picture of his guilt, it was done in such a way that I think sort of demeaned the importance of. I mean, brother and Nicole weren't even in it. It wasn't important for them to show the crime. I'm like, what? Like, how do you just dismiss them? I don't. And the fact that they didn't talk to anybody that was involved in the case, I think they did a real disservice. But it is what it is, and so I tried, again, just to focus on the facts and the evidence and to have that conversation rather than the fake, phony conspiracy ones.
Right. Well, that happened a lot. I mean, in essence, Ron Goldman got left out of a lot of people's conversations at the time.
Yeah.
It's totally unfair.
And it still happens, I mean, I think my dad and I've done a really good job of always making sure that we highlight my brother and Nicole as the reason we were here to begin with. I think over the years, it's the media and the public has gotten a lot better with, not Ron and Nicole is synonymous. You don't say one without the other. Every once in a while I will see Nicole and her friend, the other victim, which is so surprising to me. But it happens. A couple months ago I saw it on the front of a magazine, and it's just disappointing that for 25 years people still can't figure out how to say my brother's name. Yeah,
truly.
One syllable.
Yeah. How are you guys now? How's the family now? How's life for you guys now?
We're plugging along. My dad is living in Arizona with his wife. My dad volunteers at the police station there as a victim advocate. My stepmom has 3 kids who are all married and have lots of kids, so there's lots of grandchildren, nieces, and nephews around. I have a near 16-year-old kid. I run an organization, like I talked about, that provides free mental health. I'm the vice chair of the National Center for Victims of Crime, trying to make good in the world for victims and survivors. I write, I speak, I do the podcast. I do fantasy football. I'm a hockey fan. I'm just trying to function, to function in the world. Yeah. So
Canadian here. You mentioned hockey. So
I know, Blackhawks. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh,
I know.
No.
Sorry. Canucks.
I'm a Canucks fan. Oh no.
I went to a Canucks game. I went up to Vancouver, and I went to a Canucks game. It was amazing. I appreciate the sport. I was raised in Chicago, so I'm Blackhawks all the way, even in our down years. But I'm also a basketball fan. My son plays basketball, so I'm Bulls and Blackhawks to the end. But I do appreciate how hard the Raptors. I mean, that was a tremendous win. Yeah. So I will give you that too.
Yeah, there you go, Canada, eh?
Yeah.
No. Oh, well, Kim, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and it's such a sad case, and we're really, You know, what can we say? Terribly sorry for the life that you've had to deal with because of this, but I think you're doing a great job by podcasts and your books. And now, if people want to get a hold of you, and nice people only, how do they do that?
My website, which I think I need to update a little bit, it's KimberlyGoldman.com, or on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, it's Kim E. Goldman.
Oh, you're doing Twitter? So. Are you crazy?
Yeah, you know what? I do. I'm learning.
They're meanest.
They are. I shy away because I'm frustrated. I can't have an opinion outside of my brother's case because people tell me to stay in my lane. But then when I talk about my brother's case, people tell me to get over it. So I'm a little confused on what my role is.
Yeah.
I have a lot of feelings and thoughts, and I want to be part of the conversation, but I don't want to be part of the toxicity. So gotta pick and choose.
That must be really awkward if you go out on a date now. Do you ever come across people that don't know you, like have never?
Yeah.
Really?
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think part of it, is it's out of context for people, to see. I mean, people, they look at you funny, and they're not really sure why you look familiar, and I don't ever assume it's because of this, because I'm pretty active in my community, and, I go to the grocery store and I go to the dentist, and so I just assume that when people think they know me, it's because of that. I can usually tell when it's from other reasons, and so it just depends on where I'm at that day and what I disclose. I don't usually give my last name. I just introduce myself as Kim, and it's sort of, you got to feel people out. I think over the years I've learned to have a radar about where people are at and what people know, and then I get to choose as to where I let them in, and then once they know, then it's a whole weird thing, but.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. I just could imagine, you meet a guy and you're on a date and they don't know who you are. When do you tell them?
It doesn't get to be a secret for very long because I'm a pretty honest person, and it's hard to hide parts of my life because I do live a public life in some regard, and, if I'm doing an interview or I'm promoting something, it's hard to lie about that, and I don't want to lie. But usually I can tell when someone doesn't ask me about my family, they know, because that's a pretty quick question when you're starting to get to know someone. How about your family? Where'd you grow up? Do you have any siblings? Some people don't ask those things. That's usually a tell that they know about my family. When they ask those things, I'm like, okay, how am I going to broach this topic? And then I just sort of feel it out, and then there's a moment of silence and awkwardness, and then a reaction, and then it's, who knows? I've had people burst into tears, and I've had people apologize that they didn't know. I've had people apologize for not, for the verdict. I mean, it's just interesting. And I've had people also not feel comfortable dating me because they feel like they can't, rise to my standard, or that, there's a hero complex when it comes to, I don't know, people are weird.
Yeah.
But, we all have baggage. Yeah. Mine just happens to be public sometimes.
Yeah. It's a little more seeable, I guess, but,
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's just incredible.
Well, and there's a perception, I think, of me, too, that because most people have seen me very angry or crying, so therefore those are the only two things that people can see me as. So I probably overcompensate somewhere in there. Trying to be strong and, whatever that means. So, it's a dance for sure.
Yeah, always.
Yeah.
Well, we will have your website posted on ours as well as the podcast, Confronting O.J. Simpson, and so that people can do one click and find you, and nice people only.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much for talking about something. Kim Goldman is our guest. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end!
I'll see you.
You're lying to me.
be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.